right, so we only have two main big items, big topics that we need to cover for the rest of the semester. That fundamentally is beam restriction and grid use. So I'm going to kind of sprint through the KVP since we did that meticulously in the last section. I'm not going to really slow down on this very much. You've got the videos from the last section, so you can go back and review those. But just in general, as KVP increases, if the only thing that we increase is KVP, then we're going to get a drastic increase in everything. So we get increase in the X-ray photons that we create, emit, and then especially penetrate. If you remember, we said if you increase your KVP by 15%, then you would get maybe a 15 or a 30% increase in patient dose, but the image receptor dose doubled, right? So it's a drastic increase at the image receptor. So we get an increase in penetrated, and what changes there is frequency and wavelength of the X-ray photon. So unfortunately, as KVP increases, we do get an increase in the number of Comptons that eventually make it to the image receptor. So Comptons, scatter radiation, is going to lay down a layer of fog. So with the Comptons, what you have is a loss of energy. So you have a partial absorption event, and it contributes some to the patient dose, but not as much as what photoelectrics do. Now, if it bounces around inside of the patient and then becomes a photoelectric, then that's, again, a photoelectric, and it's maximum dose to the patient. So as KVP increases, the percentage of transmission of those Compton interactions increase as well, which lays down a layer of fog on the image receptor. So as KVP increases, PEs decrease, and remember, we kind of do a little bit of a dance with KVP and what happens with KVP. One is that as we increase KVP, we get that increase in the BREM spectrum, we get an increase in numbers, it pushes it towards the high energy side, and we get the high energy X-ray photons that penetrate through the patient. But at the same time, as we add those high energy photons, the likelihood of interaction with those high energy photons decreases, right? So overall exposure to the patient increases, even though those high energy photons are less likely to be absorbed inside the patient. Any kind of interaction. So KVP is your beam quality, you get more penetration, all interactions decrease at that upper register of KVP. We have fewer photoelectrics. Unfortunately, we do get a higher percentage of scatter radiation. So where we're camping out today is basically the volume of tissue exposed. So the more volume you expose, regardless of whether it's area in square inches or square centimeters, your collimation essentially, or the thickness of the tissue, then what we're going to get is more exposure to the patient and more Compton interactions as well. So what we know about KVP is that as KVP increases, we are more likely to have a Compton interaction, right? So with your larger patients, what do you not want to do? Well, again, the thickness of the tissue in a hypersonic patient is going to give us more scatter radiation. And what does KVP give us? More scatter radiation. So our technical factor of choice there is mass. All right, so the effects of KVP changes on the image, contrast and density. We did this again in the last section, and it really doesn't have all that much of an effect, except for whenever you have a really thick patient. Now, Bushong's does have a penguin that says KVP affects contrast, and it really does not until you get to a point where you've got a hypersthenic patient. It's on page 299. Collimation reduces patient radiation dose and improves image contrast. So the takeaway from that is anything that removes scatter radiation increases contrast. And we just don't see that in digital processing anymore because the main thing that controls your contrast is the computer algorithm. Exactly. So visibility to detail, anytime you see visibility functions, what we're talking about there is contrast. Okay, so you have sharpness of recorded detail, and that's how fuzzy the image might appear, and then you've got visibility, which is your contrast. So what it does affect, though, is your index number. So if we have overexposure at the image receptor, theoretically it could affect, especially especially if you have direct radiation at the image receptor, it could affect your contrast. But just the amount of tissue, it has a marginal effect, so maybe a tiny effect. So the key points here and the takeaways is increased KVP, you get more x-rays produced, more transmitted, fewer percentage scattered or absorbed. However, you have exponentially fewer absorbed than scattered, so your PE ratio changes. You get more Comptons and fewer photoelectric interactions. So in that way, Comptons increase, PEs decrease, and so you have what you're left with is a greater amount of scattered radiation, and theoretically you may have a decrease in contrast. So mass is what we're going to use to adjust for all that. If we have patient size changes, we're primarily going to use mass. If we have thickness changes, if we have pathology, we're going to have mass. Primarily we're going to use mass unless we get to a point where we've got something like what we talked about last time in or in acromegaly or osteopetrosis, where we've got such a dense structure we may need to increase KVP. Or plaster casts, it would be good to increase KVP. So what mass affects in the tube is heat. In the beam, it's just numbers. In the patient, there's a direct correlation between the mass that we use and the dose to the patient. And on the image, possible sharpness issues for the things we talked about in the last section. If we can't utilize a small focal spot because of a high mass value, then we're going to lose some sharpness for recorded detail. Long prep times gives us a blooming of the space charge, and then at long exposure time, we wind up with motion artifact, right? So that brings us up to really what we need to talk about today. So just while I'm thinking about it, remember on the test, if you get a question that is asking about exposure and KVP, exposure and mass or anything like that, just answer the question as it's asked. Don't read into it. If you increase KVP, what happens to patient dose? It goes up, right? So if you want to reduce the patient dose, you would do what with your KVP?
Go 15% reduce.
Increase by 15% and cut your mass in half, right? So the big ideas that we're left with then, again, would be collimation, which is beam restriction, and then we've got our grid use. So creation of scatter, limiting the creation of scatter, not with technique, but with the equipment, is one, and then cleaning up the scatter after it's created is the other. So the purposes for beam restriction, if you remember back to the first section of last semester, Rollins, the dentist, is the guy who came up with the concept of beam restriction. He took those pieces of leather, he's a dentist, right? He took those pieces of leather and put just a piece of lead with a hole in it, and that's what we refer to as a diaphragm, and put those wrap that around, essentially around the patient's head to limit the beam just to the area of interest. So why did he do that? Exposure to the patient, right. So where we might have a marginal effect on contrast, collimation used to really affect contrast quite a bit. Not so much anymore, but there still is that patient exposure component to it, which has become much more important than what it was before. So it limits the amount of tissue exposed, so your dose goes down, but you also create less scatter radiation. So going back up to this image here, what we've got is maybe a chest x-ray where we've exposed the entire chest, and we create, we have all the interactions that we should have. That's straight penetration, scatter, wide angle scatter, narrow angle scatter, which doesn't really matter that much. That's your Thompson, and then photoelectric, right? So if we beam restrict, if we increase our collimation, and remember, field size and collimation are kind of inversely proportional. If you increase collimation, then your field size gets smaller, right? You decrease collimation, field size gets bigger. So we increase collimation, and are we still going to have all three of those interactions, primary interactions? Yeah. But are we going to have as many? No, we're not. So we create less scatter the more we collimate. The the smaller the field size gets, the less tissue we irradiate, and the less scatter radiation we create, less fog. So, possible changes to sharpness or recorded detail, well, not sharpness, possible change to visibility, maybe. And then contrast, not so much, all that much anymore, but exposure certainly. And that's both exposure to the patient and to the image receptor as well. So just definitions, fog is any kind of unwanted density or exposure on the image receptor. And in certain technologies like your DR, your fog may be in part added because of fluorescent lighting and background radiation. We just don't see that in DR anymore. But if you're working with a CR system, then if the imaging plates have gone unused for as long as 8 hours, you have to send them through the reader and completely erase them, otherwise they have a layer of fog. So field size, beam restriction, collimation, and collimator, really pretty much all the same thing. It's the equipment we use to accomplish the same thing, and that's beam restriction to expose less tissue. And then other equipment in the collimator housing, we have the mirror and the localization light. And if you remember, the light is offset, right? The light's a little bit offset, and then it shines into the mirror, which projects the field size, and it should be congruent to or equal to the beam of radiation. So the types of restrictors we have, I'm going to kind of go in a reverse order here. This is what you use and are most familiar with, but we do have cylinder cones, we just don't use them all that much anymore. We have aperture diaphragms, and then we've got our, what we refer to as variable aperture diaphragm, and that's your collimators. Variable being that you can open and close them. So just the appearance of the collimator housing, if you're ever at clinicals and biomed is kind of doing some work on the machine and he takes the collimator housing off, go ahead and take a look at it. What you'll see is up here at the top, we've got this thing, it's what we refer to as a multi-leaf collimator. So your collimators, the ones that you think that you're adjusting, which you are these down here, the shutters that go from side to side and top to bottom, right? That's truly your variable aperture diaphragm. But this thing up here is what we refer to as a multi-leaf collimator. With a multi-leaf collimator, it's kind of like a cone. And I've got another diagram in here that shows it. See this little cone? You just can't see it all that well here. That cone is not a multi-leaf on this one, but in most of the cases it's multi-leaf, which allows that cone to open and close. So as you adjust your shutters, not only are you adjusting the shutters at the bottom, but you're adjusting multi-leaf collimators at the top. The purpose for that is to limit off-focus radiation, which is what this diagram is trying to communicate to us with this little thing coming down from the middle of the anode. So off-focus radiation, what's that?
It's whenever X-rays don't hit your focal spot?
Where they're created somewhere aside from the focal spot, right? So we talked about the difference between blooming and off-focus radiation because of that, but in this case, what we're referring to off-focus radiation is that the electrons travel across the tube really fast, and they hit the anode, and they may bounce and then re-accelerate towards the anode and create an X-ray off from where it should be created. And that's the purpose for the multi-leaf, is to catch some of those and eliminate those before they get into the X-ray beam. And the purpose for that is improve sharpness for recorded detail. So what we have then are cylinder cones. So this is a cylinder, this is a cone, and this is an extension cylinder. And what these are kind of like three-dimensional collimators. If you look on page 298, you'll see kind of a diagram of what it is that he's trying to communicate, Bushong's trying to communicate how they work. Right, so the cone kind of follows the divergent central ray. The extension cylinder pretty much just takes the very center of the central ray and utilizes it. And if you look at figure 22.13, we used to use them on sinuses quite a bit. So this thing, you could strapped to the front of your collimator housing, and then you could extend it all the way out to the skin line. So it's very effective in removing, you know, any kind of divergent central ray, so that it's just focused on what was dead square in the middle of that cone. Unfortunately, sometimes what we have with these type of collimators is a loss of sharpness of recorded detail. Excuse me, allergies are getting me. Loss of sharpness of recorded detail, but it's very minor. And it's what you may see referred to as cone cutting. And that occurs whenever x-rays are created and then they essentially bounce off of the edge of the cone and might create a secondary x-ray photon that then reduces sharpness of recorded detail. So if you happen to see in any of the textbooks or questions cone cutting, that's what it's referring to is change in penumbra because of the use of one of these things. So the cone hangs from the bottom of the collimator housing, add-on equipment. It could be an extension, or it could be the cylinder. It could be a cylinder rather than a cone. But the cones might increase penumbra. The cylinder would reduce. A diaphragm is kind of like if you were to take this thing, all right, and let's say this plate is just made out of aluminum, but it's got a hole in it. And on the bottom side of that hole, you put a thick piece of lead. It's a static collimator is essentially what it is. So it's basically the same thing that Rollins used, except for instead of tying this thing around somebody's head, what it does is it mounts to the bottom of the collimator housing, so it reduces the radiation dose and the amount of tissue you irradiate. So your collimators, you have two sets of collimators, a variable aperture diaphragm, that's what we're talking about. The multi-leaf reduces off-focus radiation and reduces that penumbra. The variable aperture diaphragm is what you're most familiar with, and that's the collimators, the shutters that you use. So two rules about collimation. One is that the field size should never be larger than what? The IR, exactly. So you have a 17 by 17 IR. You can't take the x-rays and curve them around, right, to pick up information to deposit on the image receptor. So you're just exposing the patient for no reason. So it should never be larger than the IR, but what should determine the field size? The anatomy, right. So if you're looking at your marrows, in your marrows it gives you suggested field sizes, and those are pretty much maximal, right? Nothing says that, let's say on a lateral C-spine, you have to use a 10 by 12 collimate field. You can collimate down smaller than that. So really a third one would be, don't collimate so much that you clip anatomy, right? Because the main purpose for collimation is to now do what? Improve contrast? Reduce exposure, patient exposure, right? So if you increase your collimation enough to where you don't include the anatomy of interest, what do you have to do?
Reshoot it.
Reshoot it, right? So it's effectively doubling the patient dose. So there's really three rules to it. All right, so field size questions. These are the things you should be asking yourself. How do changes of field size or changes in collimation affect X-ray production and emission? Right. So again, don't read anything into the question. It's just saying, if you increase your collimation, what do you get from the X-ray tube?
I mean, less off focus. X-ray.
Okay, let's do this. Here we go.
It's been chosen.
All right. Turn it on. It's bright, right? I'll tell you what it will do. Okay. That's bright. All right. All right, so Eric, kind of do this number. Keep going, keep going.
Oh boy.
Get closer to it.
Okay.
Okay. So is there more or less light on the board? Less. There's less. Is the flashlight putting out any less?
No.
No.
Answer is no. Okay. So applying that to the X-ray tube, as you collimate, what happens to creation and emission?
Nothing.
Nothing, right, nothing. Okay, you.
Like,
All right, so nothing happens to production or emission from the protective housing, but what happens to emission from the collimated housing? Goes down, right. So, how does that change patient dose?
It lowers
It goes down, right. You've exposed less tissue, so it goes down. How does it affect image contrast?
Doesn't really.
Maybe very marginally, not a whole lot. Again, your computer algorithm is a main thing. I would hang on to the concept or the thought that it might affect your contrast all the way through the registry because you might see it, but in reality, if you collimate down in clinicals, you might not be able to see any kind of difference, right?
So,
yeah.
question like test questions, it would affect contrast?
Yeah.
Would it like increase our contrast?
Yes. Yeah. So anytime you have fog decreases contrast. So if you can prevent it from being created or remove it after it's created before it hits an image receptor, then theoretically contrast improves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so how does it affect scatter production? Increased collimation, it goes down, right? It decreases the production of scatter. How does it affect image receptor exposure? Decreases, exactly. So if you need to change field size, let's say you increase your collimation, let's say you're doing a KUB versus an AP of the L spine. So AP of the L spine, your collimated field is probably only going to be about 7 inches wide. With KUB, it's going to be, some of us wider than others. So if you remove that density because you increase your collimation, what might you have to do?
Up the mass?
Increase mass. Why mass?
Well, because you don't want to add more scatter.
Don't want to add more scatter, right? So you remove scatter, you prevented it from being created, you don't want to increase KVP, you want to increase mass. Very good. So what's your general rule? Because you might be thinking, well, how much of a change of mass do I need? What's your general rule for pathologies?
2.
That's if you need to repeat an exam, you need to double it, right? But your rule of thumb for pathologies, say you have an additive pathology, you need to increase your mass by 30 to 50%. Same thing here. It's stock answer is 30 to 50%. So again, you can test this out in clinicals. If you happen to have a skull, you can make an exposure on skull and then collimate in and make a second exposure on it and see what your index number shows you. You can do the same thing, let's say you turn your automatic exposure off and then see what different mass you get for the collimated versus the non-collimated. And then you can turn the automatic exposure back on and do it again and see what happens to your mass value. So it should theoretically increase by 30 to 50%. All right, so we compensate with mass, no change in penetration. You might get an appearance, if contrast truly does improve, then you might get an appearance of a more black and white image that might make you think that you got less penetration, but you really didn't. The only thing that controls your penetration is KVP, exactly. So how does it affect occupational dose?
Goes down.
It goes down, exactly. So if you have to be in the room with a patient, you collimate in, then you have less scatter radiation coming off the patient. It would reduce your patient dose. So the options for limiting field sizes, again, are those things that we took a look at before. So production versus emission from the tube and versus emission from the collimator housing. So the things that affect the brim spectrum are the things that affect emission from the protective housing. That's your KVP, your time, your filtration, MA, and your machine phase. So beam restriction limits how much of that beam reaches the patient. So how collimation affects patient dose, we talked about that. Less tissue irradiated, less patient dose, less scatter radiation created. So how does it affect contrast? Just memorize that potentially could. You probably aren't gonna see that much of an appreciable change. Contrast, grayscale, opposite of each other, so pretty much the same thing there. Sharpness, really not any change in sharpness unless you get into things like the cones, the extension cones and things like that. Visibility, again, is your contrast. You might see something, but certainly we're gonna see both changes in exposure at the patient level and at the image receptor. So it's, again, since collimation doesn't really affect this stuff quite as much as what it used to, then this becomes our primary reason for collimation, right? And I think I kind of went off on a miniature rant last week, talking about the images I see on Facebook and the x-ray groups and the lack of collimation, total lack of collimation. Somebody posted it was a beautiful odontoid, but they included from ears to eyes to thyroid, right? So how much of that do you need? You know, an area about that big, about as big as 3 to 4 fingers is about all you need. So it becomes more of a radiation safety thing for the patient, and what do you need to try to keep your radiation dose to? As low as reasonably achievable, right? So if you're shooting an odontoid and you get the orbits, is that as low as reasonably achievable?
No.
No, it is not. So practice collimation. So we're just going to run through field size and collimation, remembering that they're opposite of each other. Increase in field size decreases collimation. Increase in field size increases the number of photons in the primary beam, remembering that you don't create any more, you just let more out of the collimator housing. That increases the amount of tissue being irradiated, which increases the number of possible interactions, including that scatter radiation. That scatter spreads a layer of fog across the image and potentially decreasing contrast and increasing image receptor exposure. So you might see, with an increase in field size, you might see at your image receptor exposure, you might see a change in your index number. But as far as density goes, it's again going to be controlled by your computer algorithm.
So it wouldn't do much to your visibility.
It really doesn't. So going at it with a different terminology, increase in collimation reduces field size, reducing the number of photons of primary beam, and doing all the same stuff. Irradiating less tissue, creating the scatter radiation. Less scatter strikes the image receptor, removes that layer of fog, and prevents it from being deposited on the image receptor. And if it does increase contrast, again, it might improve visibility, but again, it's going to be negligible. All right, so important consideration. Again, every year I'll have students that view collimation as focusing. All right, remember the things that you can do with X-ray beam. You can transmit it, you can scatter it, and you can block it. But where it differs from light is you can't bend it, right? So you can't focus it. Since you can't focus it, then the only thing that you can do is block it, right? So when we increase collimation, that's what we're doing. We're not focusing, and I think part of the confusion comes in whenever people use the terminology, well, we're going to collimate down so that we can focus on the L spine. Okay, well, that's focusing your eyes on the L spine as opposed to, overall abdomen. But that's not the same as focus in the stream of X-rays. The stream of X-rays does not focus, you just block it and you prevent some of it from striking the image receptor. Okay, see the difference between the two? The X-ray beam is not focused, but you can focus your attention by increasing your collimation on the things that you're most interested in seeing. Got it? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So again, technical compensation for collimation again is going to be your mass, and it's going to be 30 to 50%. When you're using automatic exposure, let's say again you shoot KUB in the abdomen. You make an exposure, you get a good index number, and you collimate in for just the L spine. what is probably gonna happen if you're phototiming?
It's gonna take longer.
It's gonna take longer, right? So it's naturally gonna drive your mass up by, if the theory holds true, 30 to 50%, right? So it's always gonna be mass, according to the textbook. Now, you go into clinicals and you push the button for an asthenic patient for a KUV, and what you might see is 75 kVp, right? You push the button for a hypersthenic patient, what might you see? 80, 85 even. Okay, so is that a contradiction? It is. According to the literature, it is. You should just increase your mass whenever you increase, patient size or increase collimation or anything like that. But does any of that really substantially affect your contrast? The answer is no. So since KVP doesn't really affect your contrast, is it okay to increase your KVP when you go from an asthenic to hypersthenic patient? The answer is yeah. All right, so this is where it's going to get a little bit sticky. There is some math on this test. So if you look on page 298, so calculation of field size. So what you see on 298, figure 22.11, aperture diaphragm is fixed lead opening, designed for fixed image receptor size. And what he's describing there is 4 different things. So you've got your source, which is your anode, right? Source to diaphragm distance is SDD, and that's very short. And then SID, you know what that is. And then you've got field size opening, right? So there is math on this test, but I'm pretty sure that I've taken all the math straight out of DeAngelis. So just do your DeAngelis, and it should be easy enough for you. Okay. So let's kind of work through this one. All right. So you see that I've got, big over big equals little over little. So if you look at the problem or the formula on page 298, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? It's A over SDD equals C over SID, okay? That's easier to remember. So we know that whenever an X-ray beam is created, we go from the source, which is the anode, and it diverges, right? So in our problem, what we've got is a 10x4 diaphragm that's 5 inches below the source. So we've got 5 inches here, okay? This is our projected field size, and we don't know what that is. Size, we don't know what that is. We've got a source to image receptor distance at 40 inches, okay? And then this is what, 10 by 4?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 10 by 4, okay. All right, this is a ratio type problem, all right? So what you've got is 2 different qualities or 2 different quantities that compare to each other, but they're totally different, okay? So in all this, what are your 2 big measurements? Is that big? No. Is that big?
No.
No. Is that big?
Yes.
No, compared to that, yeah. Is that big?
Yes.
Compared to that, yes. Okay. So we've established we've got our bigs, right? So we're going to say 40 over x is equal to, now we've got our littles. Now which one of the littles corresponds to and is most similar to this distance here?
Yeah, the 5
The 5
inches.
Yeah, the 5 inches, all right? So we've got 5 over, we'll go with 10.
Where are you pulling
Okay.
the 10 from?
The 10 by 4. Okay. So sometimes these problems will give you a circular diaphragm opening, sometimes it'll be, excuse me, rectangular. All right. So how do we solve for this?
Cross multiply each other.
cross multiply and divide, right? So 40 times 10 is 400, and it equals 5x. So now we divide both sides by 5, and what do we get? X is equal to 80. So it's a great big field size, right? So I don't know that I've ever seen a problem in any registry review book where you actually had to work out both of the dimensions. If you just get one of them, then you're golden. Now here's the thing. So you get to the test and you say, okay, I don't remember which big to put on top and which little to put on top. Does it matter? The answer is no. It's a ratio type problem. So let's say, if as long as you keep the things that you're comparing across from each other. So let's work it again and say, I don't remember which big to put on top. I'm going to put that one on top. So that's going to be x over 40. So what corresponds to the 40? 5 over 10. And what do we have? 400 equals 5x. Same thing. It doesn't matter if you invert it, as long as you invert both of them. Okay? So if you come out with something just really outlandish, that's probably what you did, is you inverted one, but you didn't invert the other. Okay?
So you just keep your, like on this, you just keep your SIDs just together.
Right. Keep your SID and your SDD together, and then your horizontal distances together. So your vertical across from each other, horizontal across from each other.
So if we change the 10 by 4 number to like a 12 by 3, you take the bigger number, like a 12?
Well, either one.
You
Either one.
can
So,
use a 4?
so yeah. So in this case, we could take the 4, and I didn't work them both. You certainly work them both, but I don't think I've ever seen one. If you just get one of them, you can pick it out of the. If you happen to have one that had 80, or two answers that had 80 on them, you might have to work out the second one. But generally speaking, if you work one properly, you can pick it out of the answers. Okay? So field size calculation. Big over big, little over little. Okay? Any questions on that?
So, what you're saying on that one is there would be like 2 answers? And if you
Potentially it
plug
could be
in-
2 answers. Yeah, you could work out the other one, and I can bring that back up and we could get the actual,
I was just trying to.
Yeah.
make sure I was-
yeah. So it will be, I guess the full answer would be, how much was it? So it increased, well, we'll just go ahead and do it. We'll go ahead and do it.
Oh, you just.
Oh. So your overall field size then, just working it, I'll take this one off. So then we've got 40 over x is equal to
5 over 4.
5 over 4, right? So it'd be 160 is equal to 5x, so that'd be 32
Yes.
is equal to x, okay? So your overall field size then would be 32 by 80 square inches, okay? But again, I'd say at least 9 times out of 10, all you gotta do is get to one of them and just pick it out of the answers. Okay.
So could you give an example of a question where the answer would be only one of the numbers?
The only time that it would just be one would be if it was a round diaphragm opening. So, you may have a question that says, a round diaphragm opening is 5 inches below the target, then it'd just be, one measurement instead of 2. So rectangular openings are typically gonna be 2. Okay, so tissue thickness then, and I didn't really like the way Bushong kind of set this chapter up. He starts into tissue thickness, and then he goes straight into beam restriction, and then he goes back into tissue thickness. But we've talked about this already, and that is, the thicker the tissue, the more dose the patient's gonna have, more likelihood that we're gonna have scatter radiation. So tissue thickness, how does it affect patient dose? You're gonna have to increase your mass. You might increase your KVP, since it doesn't really have as much of an effect on contrast as what it used to. You might increase your KVP instead of your mass, but either one that you go with, patient dose is gonna increase. So, how it affects scatter radiation, the more tissue, regardless of if it's area or thickness, the more tissue you irradiate, the more scatter radiation you're gonna create. So, again, with tissue thickness, we're gonna increase scatter. Does it affect contrast? I'm gonna say yes in this case. And if you've ever taken an x-ray on a really, really big patient, and then taking an x-ray on a very, very thin patient, you see the difference in contrast. With a KUB on a very thin patient, what you're gonna be seeing is, very high contrast. It's gonna look real black and white, as opposed to somebody, I use the number 400 pounds. You get a 400-pound patient, and it's gonna be really, really milky and washed out looking. Okay, so tissue thickness truly will affect your scatter radiation, and that's patient issues more than anything else. Now, is it gonna affect the contrast if you collimate in on that thick patient? The visibility, the appearance of the L-spine versus the KUB, probably much less so than what you would expect, right? So it's not gonna affect contrast within a person as much, but certainly the more tissue you irradiate thickness-wise, the thicker the patient, the less contrast you're gonna have. The longer your grayscale, exposure is gonna go up dramatically. Sharpness of recorded detail can be affected depending on what you're looking at in that thick patient. Your kidneys, for example, are about 1/3 of the way through your body, right? So let's say you've got somebody whose ASIS to tabletop measurement is 10 inches. How close are their kidneys to the image receptor? About 3 inches tops, right? So now you've got somebody who's 24 inches. So how close is that gonna be? It's gonna increase distance, and then anytime you increase distance, you lose sharpness of recorded detail, right? So in that case, we can have some differences in sharpness. And because of the gray image, we're gonna have some visibility issues.
Could that be like a question like comparing like hyperstenic to astenic patient? What could it do to sharpness of recorded detail?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. All right, so thickness of the patient, the thicker the patient, the more scatter we create. Are those scattered photons likely to hit the image receptor if we don't change anything? The answer is no. So here's another common misconception, right? So what is scatter? It's fog. Fog is an unwanted density, right? So what type of patient creates more scatter radiation? Hypersthenic patient. So what you're gonna have a tendency to do is say, okay, I got a hypersthenic patient, they create more scatter radiation. Since they create more scatter radiation, scatter is a layer of fog, which is a layer of unwanted density. So scatter equals density, so hypersthenic patient, what do I need to do? Well, at some point you're gonna have a tendency to kind of wrap everything around and say, it's density, right? So I need to decrease my technique. It's unwanted density. And no is the answer. Because most of that scatter gets is created inside of the patient, and it gets absorbed before it gets through the patient. So you walk partway through that. The thicker the patient, you create more scatter, yes, but most of that scatter is going to be absorbed inside of the patient, and so your image receptor exposure decreases dramatically, so you have to increase technique.
So is that why patient dose goes up because so much scatter is absorbed in the patient still?
Exactly.
Okay, and so you would go up in your mass in order to get your IR exposure higher?
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Because they're still gonna absorb just as many with a low mass?
Yeah.
It doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. Okay,
They're gonna absorb more than somebody who's not hyperstenic.
okay.
Alright, so with patient thickness, we're gonna create the scatter, but it's gonna be absorbed and the image receptor exposure drops. Therefore, we have to increase our mass pretty dramatically. X-ray production doesn't really do anything. Do changes of patient thickness affect X-ray production? Providing you haven't changed anything. No. But if you are phototiming, what's gonna happen?
You're gonna go up in the
Phototimer's gonna increase your mass for you, and you're gonna have a higher mass value, right? So again, now we're back to, mock you up a patient. Skull's really not gonna do this for you, but if you get one of those basins of water and you put maybe, 2 inches worth of water in it, make an exposure, and then you put 5 inches worth of water in it and make your exposure, see what happens when you phototime. And what you should get is an increase in density, or an increase in mass. So when phototiming, you don't have to do anything. Remember, your phototimer is the one type of timer that you don't have to control. It controls the exposure for you. But if you're setting a technique, then you're gonna have to increase your mass. You don't wanna increase KVP significantly because of increase in scatter radiation. So, do changes in patient thickness affect penetration? And we just kind of walked through that. Yeah, drastically, right? So because we get all that scatter and the more scatter events take place inside of the patient, eventually it's gonna absorb inside of the patient. So we have to increase something. Again, you're gonna have a tendency to think, well, we got penetration. What controls penetration?
KVP.
KVP, right, so I need to increase my KVP. And again, according to the literature, the answer is no. You don't need to increase your KVP. You have fewer photons that are penetrated, but theoretically, your KVP is high enough to penetrate that patient. In other words, 80 KVP is enough for anybody, for an abdomen, no matter how big they are. Okay, so again, your asthenic patient, 80 KVP is more than enough. Your hypersthenic patient, you can get through them with 80 KVP. Is it ideal?
No.
No. Dose goes through the roof. And what is it we're trying to keep our dose to?
As low as
As
possible.
low as reasonably achievable, right? So the literature is still saying increase your mass, but on your machine you hit hypersthenic and what happens? KVP goes up, right? And I don't disagree with that, right? Because your contrast is really a product of your computer algorithm. So how do changes in thickness affect patient dose? We talked about that. It's going to go through the roof. And occupational dose, you're doing a fluoro exam on an asthenic patient. How much scatter do they create?
Not much.
Not much. Do one on a hypersthenic patient.
A lot.
It's going to be a lot more, right? So your occupational dose is going to increase. So what do?
Stand back behind your PA.
Stand back and get behind somebody where you led. Exactly. All right. So again, mass is our technical consideration or technical factor that we want to change with thickness. So KVP and mass, either one can be used to compensate for tissue thicknesses, changes in tissue thickness. Mass is still your preferred. KVP will work just as well. You're really not going to see all that much of a difference in contrast. So if, though, you've got two things, you've got an increase in tissue thickness that goes above 10 centimeters, or you increase your KVP to up to 70 KVP or above, very good.
User grid.
User grid, right, and that's where we're going next. So, how does scatter affect contrast? It really depends. If you really got a hypersthenic patient, you're gonna lose some contrast. How does it affect density? It's really not. It's gonna affect your index number, but the actual density that you visualize, not so much. Okay. Any questions?